What if the real reason people give up learning English isn't because it's too hard, but because no one shows them how language actually lives inside real life? In the burning heat of Texas, a slow conversation, cultural surprises, and an unexpected love story quietly changed the way I practiced English, tested my patience, and taught me lessons about love, communication, and never quitting. Texas heat and a hard question. Picture this for a moment. You step outside your apartment in Texas in the middle of July. The air feels thick. The sun is already bright, even though it is only 9 in the morning. The heat presses against your skin like a warm blanket you did not ask for. Welcome to Texas. People often joke that Texas has 2 seasons. Hot and hotter. At first, I thought it was just humor. Then I experienced my first Texas summer, and I realized something important. They were not joking. But strangely, the heat was not the hardest part of my new life in America. The hardest part was English. Not the English from textbooks. Not the English from grammar exercises. I mean real English. The kind people speak quickly at grocery stores, coffee shops, bus stops, and offices. The kind of English that does not wait for you to understand. The first week I arrived in Texas, everything sounded like fast music without subtitles. Words blended together. Sentences flew past my ears before my brain could catch them. Someone at a store said something friendly to me. I froze. My brain began searching through every English word I had ever learned. Nothing came out. Finally, I smiled and said the safest word I knew. Okay. The person nodded politely, but inside I knew something.
I did not understand what they said.
If you are learning English right now, you probably know this feeling. Your mind studies vocabulary. You read articles. You memorize grammar. But when a real person speaks, suddenly everything disappears. Psychologists actually have a simple explanation for this. Your brain processes a second language in a different way than your native language. When someone speaks quickly, your brain must translate, interpret tone, recognize vocabulary, and understand meaning, all at the same time. That is a lot of work. When the pressure is high, the brain sometimes chooses the easiest solution. It freezes. Many learners think this moment means they are bad at English. But the truth is simpler. Your brain is just overwhelmed. In fact, research in language learning shows that comprehension improves fastest when people hear slower. Meaningful conversation connected to real emotions or real experiences. Not random grammar drills. Real life. And that is exactly what Texas gave me. Real life. Everywhere. The first few weeks felt like a strange experiment. The heat outside was intense, but the social culture felt surprisingly warm. People in Texas talked to strangers. A lot. At first, this confused me. Someone in a grocery store line would suddenly say, "Hot day, huh?" Another person might laugh and answer, "Welcome to Texas." At a gas station, someone might ask, "You new around here?" These conversations were short, simple, and casual. But something interesting happened. I started understanding them. Not perfectly, not immediately, but little by little. You see, the sentences were simple, the speed was slower, and the topics were familiar. Weather, food, traffic, Texas heat. And slowly, my brain began to relax. Language learning experts sometimes call this low-pressure input. When your brain does not feel judged or rushed, it absorbs language more naturally. It is the same way children learn. through repetition, emotion, and everyday life. But something else was happening too. Something I did not expect. Texas heat was teaching me patience. Because when you live in extreme heat, you cannot rush everything. You move a little slower. You breathe more carefully. You notice your surroundings. Strangely, this slower rhythm helped my English. Instead of trying to sound perfect, I began trying to sound real. Instead of memorizing complicated words, I focused on simple ones. Instead of speaking fast, I spoke clearly. And something magical started happening.
People understood me.
Not because my English was perfect, but because my communication was honest. One afternoon, while escaping the heat, I walked into a small coffee shop. The air inside was cool, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the room. I ordered slowly. "Hi, can I get an iced coffee, please?" The barista smiled and said, "Good choice. It's way too hot today." That sentence might sound simple, but for me, it felt like a small victory. I understood every word. I felt like a participant in the conversation. That small moment changed something inside my mind. Instead of asking, "Why is English so difficult?" I started asking a different question. What if English becomes easier when life becomes part of the classroom? Because real language lives inside real moments, inside laughter, inside mistakes, inside small conversations with strangers, and sometimes inside unexpected love stories that begin in the middle of a hot Texas summer. At that time, I did not know that one simple conversation inside that coffee shop would eventually lead to something much bigger than language practice. It would test my patience. It would test my courage. And yes, it would test my heart. Because learning English in Texas turned out to be more than learning a language. It became a story about culture, connection, and discovering that patience, like love, often grows stronger under pressure. Or in this case, under the Texas heat. And the real story was only just beginning. My first shock in Texas. Texas does not introduce itself gently. It arrives with sunlight so bright that your eyes narrow without permission. The air feels warm even in the morning. By the afternoon, the heat sits on your shoulders like an invisible backpack. During my first week in Texas, I learned something quickly. People here respect two things: big skies and honest conversations. But before I could understand those conversations, I had to survive my first real culture shock. And strangely, the shock was not only about weather. It was about language. You might imagine that learning English in America means instant improvement. After all, you hear English everywhere. On the street, in stores, on the radio, on television. It sounds like the perfect classroom, but reality is a little different. When I first arrived, my brain expected clear textbook English, slow sentences, perfect grammar, polite pauses. Instead, I heard something very different. Fast English, relaxed English, connected English. For example, one afternoon, I walked into a grocery store. The cashier looked at me and smiled. "How's it going?" Simple sentence, right? But my brain began searching for meaning like a computer opening too many windows at once. How is it going? Is this a question about transportation? About my direction? About my plan for the day? While my brain was thinking, the line behind me grew longer. People were waiting. The moment felt bigger than it actually was. Finally, I answered carefully. Good, thank you. The cashier nodded politely and continued scanning groceries. Later, I discovered something funny. How's it going? Is not really a serious question. In American culture, especially in places like Texas, it is more like a friendly greeting. It means hello, but with a little warmth. Language researchers sometimes call this social language. It is different from academic English. Social language is not about perfect grammar. It is about connection. And in Texas, connection happens quickly. One morning I walked into a gas station to buy water. The man at the counter looked outside at the bright sky and said, "Man, it's already hot." I understood one word clearly. Hot. That word became my best friend during my first Texas summer. So, I answered with a sentence I practiced many times.
Yes.
Very hot. The man laughed. Just wait until August. At the time, I did not know if he was joking. Later, I learned he was not. But something interesting happened during that short conversation. I felt less nervous. Not because my English suddenly became perfect, but because the conversation was simple and human. Weather, temperature, daily life. These topics may seem small, but they are powerful tools for language learners. Studies in communication psychology show that predictable topics help the brain process language faster. When you already understand the context, your brain does not need to work as hard. And Texas gave me the same context every day.
Heat. Sunday sweat.
Cold drinks. Slowly, those simple conversations became my daily training. At a bus stop, someone said, "You picked a hot summer to move here." At a coffee shop, a woman laughed and said, "Iced coffee season never ends in Texas." Each sentence was like a tiny English lesson. But here is the surprising part. The biggest challenge was not vocabulary. It was speed. Native speakers connect words together. They shorten sounds. They remove pauses. Going to becomes gonna. Want to becomes wanna. Did you eat becomes did ya eat? The first time I heard these phrases, they sounded like completely new words. Linguists call this connected speech, and it is one reason many learners feel lost when listening to native English. Your brain expects separate words, but native speakers deliver music. Fast music. At first, this frustrated me. I would walk home thinking, why did I study English for years if I cannot understand simple conversations? That thought is dangerous for many learners, because once frustration grows, motivation begins to shrink. Psychologists call this the confidence gap. When learners believe their progress is slow, they start avoiding situations that could actually improve their skills. But Texas had a solution for that problem too. You see, the culture here encourages friendliness. People talk. Even when conversations are short. Even when you are a stranger. One afternoon, I returned to the same small coffee shop where I had ordered iced coffee before. The cool air felt like a small miracle after walking under the sun. The barista recognized me. "You're back," she said with a smile. Her sentence was simple, but recognition changes everything. When someone remembers you, the conversation becomes easier. Your brain relaxes. Your words come out more naturally. "I ordered again. Iced coffee, please." She laughed softly. Smart choice in this weather. Then she asked another question. "So, are you new in Texas?" This time, I did not freeze. "Yes, I said slowly. I moved here recently. Welcome, she said warmly. Texas summers are a test of patience. A test of patience. That phrase stayed in my mind long after I left the coffee shop. Because she was right. The heat tests your patience. The culture tests your patience. And learning English definitely tests your patience. But patience is also how progress begins. Little conversations. Short sentences. Small victories. And sometimes those simple moments open doors you never expected. At that time, I did not realize that this same coffee shop would soon become more than a place to escape the Texas heat. It would become my daily English classroom, and it would introduce me to someone who would quietly change the direction of my story. But before that happened, I still had to face the most common challenge every language learner knows. The moment when motivation disappears. The moment when quitting feels easier than continuing. And that moment was coming sooner than I expected. Why many people quit English. There is a quiet moment many English learners experience, but almost nobody talks about it. It usually happens after the excitement fades. In the beginning, learning English feels like opening a new door. You buy notebooks. You watch videos. You practice new words with energy and curiosity. Everything feels possible. Then reality arrives. Not like a storm, more like a slow leak. One day you listen to a conversation and understand only a few words. Another day someone asks a simple question, and your mind becomes completely blank. And slowly a thought appears. Maybe I'm just not good at English. That thought is powerful. In fact, psychologists say the biggest obstacle in language learning is not vocabulary or grammar. It is belief. Once the brain believes progress is impossible, it quietly begins protecting you from embarrassment. You avoid speaking. You avoid conversations. You avoid situations where English might challenge you. Your brain thinks it is helping, but it is actually slowing your growth. I remember the exact week when this feeling arrived for me in Texas. The summer heat was stronger than ever. The sun felt closer to the ground. Even the wind seemed warm. One afternoon I walked through a busy supermarket, trying to buy a few simple things: bread, fruit, and cold water. Nothing complicated. But when I reached the checkout counter, something strange happened. The cashier spoke quickly. "Did you find everything okay?" At least that is what it sounded like. One long word. My brain froze. "Did you find everything okay?" By the time I understood the sentence, the moment had already passed. People were waiting behind me. The line was growing. My answer came out slowly. "Yes, thank you." The cashier smiled politely, but I walked out of the store feeling frustrated. Why did such a simple sentence feel so difficult? This is where science gives us an interesting explanation. When you listen to a second language, your brain performs 3 tasks at the same time. First, it recognizes sounds. Second, it identifies words. Third, it connects those words to meaning. Native speakers do this automatically because their brains have processed the language for many years. But language learners must build those connections slowly. And here is the surprising part. Speed is the real enemy. Studies in language acquisition show that when speech is just slightly faster than your comprehension level, your brain enters something called processing overload. It simply cannot keep up. So, what happens next? Your brain fills the gap with doubt. I can't understand. I'm too slow. Maybe English is not for me. Millions of learners stop practicing right at this stage. Not because they are incapable, but because they misunderstand what is happening inside their brain. The truth is simpler. Your brain is still building the pathway. Think of it like exercising a new muscle. The first days feel uncomfortable. Movements are slow. But with repetition, strength appears. Language works the same way. At that time, however, I did not know this yet. I only knew one thing. I was tired. Tired of replaying conversations in my mind. Tired of wondering if people understood my accent. Tired of pretending I understood everything. One evening, after another hot Texas day, I sat alone in my apartment. Outside, the sky was turning orange. The air was still warm even after sunset. I asked myself a question many learners secretly ask. Why am I doing this? Why keep struggling with English? The easiest solution would have been simple. Stop trying. Many people do exactly that. They limit their conversations. They stay inside their comfort zone. They speak only when necessary. Life becomes easier, but progress disappears. Luckily, something small interrupted my negative thinking. My phone buzzed. It was a message reminder I had set for myself weeks earlier. A simple sentence. Practice one real conversation today. At first, I laughed. One conversation? After such a difficult day. But the reminder made me curious. What if the goal was not perfection? What if the goal was simply participation? Language researchers often talk about something called micropractice. Instead of trying to master a language quickly, learners focus on small, daily interactions. One conversation, one question, one honest attempt. These small moments slowly train the brain to handle real language. I looked outside my window again. The sky was darker now. Streetlights were turning on. Somewhere nearby, music was playing softly. And suddenly I remembered the small coffee shop I had visited earlier that week.
Cool air.
Friendly smiles. Simple conversations about the weather. Maybe that place could become my practice ground. Not a classroom. Not a grammar lesson. Just real English. Real people.
Real moments.
The next day, I decided to try again. Not to prove my English was perfect, but to prove something else. That patience can grow stronger than frustration. And strangely enough, that decision would lead me back to the same coffee shop, the same barista, and eventually a conversation that would change more than just my English. Because sometimes the path to confidence begins with the smallest possible step. A simple greeting, a slow sentence, or even a quiet smile across a coffee counter on another blazing Texas afternoon. And that was exactly where my real English journey was about to deepen. A coffee shop changed my practice. Strange things happen when you stop trying to sound perfect. Your shoulders relax. Your breathing slows. Words begin to come out naturally instead of fighting their way through your mind. For me, that shift happened in a small coffee shop hiding from the Texas heat. The place was not famous. It was not big. It did not have bright neon lights or loud music. But it had something better for an English learner. Conversations. Real ones. Every afternoon the air outside felt like opening an oven. The sun reflected off the sidewalks. Even the wind felt warm. So walking into that coffee shop felt like stepping into a quiet island of cool air. The doorbell made a small sound.
Ding.
The smell of roasted coffee filled the room. Behind the counter stood the same barista I had seen before. She had the relaxed confidence that many Texans seem to carry naturally. She smiled when she saw me. Back again? 3 simple words. But something about them felt welcoming. Recognition is powerful for language learners. When someone already knows you, the pressure disappears. You are no longer a stranger trying to prove something. You are just another person in the room. I nodded. Yes, iced coffee, please. She laughed softly. You're surviving the Texas summer the right way. The right way. Another small phrase my brain stored like a treasure. At first our conversations stayed simple. Weather, temperature, cold drinks. But something interesting happened after a few visits. The conversations became a little longer. One afternoon she asked, "So where are you from?" This time my answer came more easily. "I moved here recently," I said, "still learning how Texas works." She smiled. "Well, rule number 1, she said, pointing toward the bright window. Never fight the heat. That sentence made me laugh. And laughter is a secret tool in language learning. When people laugh together, their brains relax. Anxiety drops. Words flow more easily. Communication scientists call this emotional safety. When your brain feels safe, it becomes more open to processing language. Without realizing it, that coffee shop was becoming my language laboratory. Not a place for grammar tests. A place for small, human conversations. I began noticing patterns. Texans love friendly questions. They talk to strangers easily. And many conversations begin with the same topics. Weather,
food, work,
local events. These predictable topics are incredibly helpful for learners. Your brain begins recognizing common phrases. How's your day going? Staying cool out there? You getting used to Texas yet? At first I answered carefully. Slow words. Short sentences. But every day my confidence grew a little. Language learning researchers say repetition in natural environments is one of the fastest ways to improve listening ability. Your brain begins recognizing rhythm,
tone,
pronunciation patterns, and slowly, what once sounded like noise becomes meaning. But the coffee shop gave me something even more valuable than listening practice. It gave me speaking courage. One afternoon the shop was busier than usual. People were talking quietly at tables. Someone was typing on a laptop. Music played softly in the background. I ordered my usual iced coffee and waited near the counter. The barista placed the cup in front of me. You're improving, she said. I blinked. Improving? Your English, she explained. You sound more relaxed now. That moment surprised me. Because when you are learning a language, progress often feels invisible. You only notice mistakes. But sometimes other people notice growth before you do. Her observations stayed in my mind long after I left the shop. Maybe progress was happening after all. Maybe the secret was not studying harder. Maybe the secret was living the language. Small talk. Daily routines. Simple honesty. And, of course, patience. But that afternoon something else happened. Something small, yet unforgettable. A new customer walked into the coffee shop. The doorbell rang.
Ding.
The person looked around the room for a moment before stepping up to the counter.
Tall. Calm.
Moving slowly, as if the heat outside had followed them in. The barista greeted them casually. Hot enough for you? They laughed. Always in Texas. I listened quietly, the way language learners often do, observing, collecting phrases. Then the barista looked toward me. "You two might get along," she said jokingly, both escaping the heat. The stranger turned slightly and smiled. "Good strategy," they said. The sentence was simple, but something about the tone felt friendly, natural. I nodded politely. "Yes," I said. "Texas is very hot." They laughed again. That's the most accurate sentence about Texas I've heard today. Everyone at the counter smiled. For a moment the conversation paused, but the atmosphere had changed. What started as a quiet English practice place was slowly becoming something more social, more human, more interesting. And that small interaction made me realize something important. Language is not only about words. It is about connection, about curiosity, about the courage to stay in a conversation even when your sentences are imperfect. That afternoon I sat at a small table near the window, sipping iced coffee and watching people move through the shop. Outside, the sun continued its relentless Texas performance. Inside, conversations flowed gently from table to table. And somewhere between the sound of coffee machines and quiet laughter, I understood something new. Maybe learning English did not require a perfect plan. Maybe it simply required showing up. Showing up to real places, real people, real conversations. And sometimes, when you show up enough times, life quietly introduces new characters into your story. At that moment, I did not know that the stranger from the counter would soon become part of my daily conversations, part of my English practice, and eventually part of the deeper lesson Texas was teaching me about patience, because the heat outside was only one test. The real test was still coming, and it would challenge more than just my language skills. Small English conversations, big progress. Language rarely improves in one dramatic moment. It grows quietly, one sentence at a time, one small conversation at a time. And sometimes the biggest progress begins with the simplest words. After a few weeks of visiting the same coffee shop in Texas, something unexpected happened to my English practice. It became normal. At first, every conversation had felt like a test. My brain was always searching for the correct word, the correct grammar, the correct pronunciation. But slowly that pressure began to disappear. The coffee shop was becoming a routine part of my day. I would walk through the door, hear the familiar bell, feel the cool air on my face, and order the same drink. Iced coffee, please. Simple, predictable, but repetition has power. Language scientists often explain that the brain learns fastest when patterns repeat in real situations. When your brain hears the same phrases again and again, it begins recognizing them automatically. No translation needed. That is exactly what was happening. One afternoon, the barista greeted me with a sentence I had heard many times. "How's your day going?" But this time something surprising happened. I did not pause. I answered immediately. "Pretty good. Just trying to stay cool." The sentence came out naturally, like it had been waiting inside my mind for the right moment. The barista smiled. "Same here," she said. Texas summer is no joke. Texas summer is no joke. Another phrase my brain quickly saved. You see, real English is full of these casual expressions. They are not always logical. Sometimes they sound strange when you translate them directly, but they make conversations feel human. And that was the real lesson I was learning. English is not only grammar. It is rhythm,
tone,
emotion, small talk. Researchers studying second language learning often talk about conversation loops. These are predictable exchanges that happen again and again in everyday life. For example, how's it going? Good, how about you? Hot today. Yeah, really hot. These simple loops train your brain to react faster. The more you hear them, the more natural they become. And Texas provided endless opportunities for these loops. At the coffee shop, at the grocery store, at the gas station, even waiting in line somewhere, people would comment on the heat. Every time. One afternoon, the stranger I had seen earlier in the coffee shop walked in again. I recognized them immediately. They ordered something cold, just like I did. While waiting, they glanced outside at the bright sky. Another hot one, they said casually. For the first time since arriving in Texas, I felt ready to respond without overthinking. Yes, I said with a smile. Texas is teaching me patience. They laughed. That's the best survival skill here. The conversation lasted maybe 10 seconds. But those 10 seconds mattered. Because something had changed inside my brain. Instead of translating every word, I was participating. Participating is the moment language begins transforming into communication. And communication builds confidence. Later that afternoon, while sitting with my coffee, I reflected on something interesting. Why were these small conversations helping me more than hours of studying grammar? The answer is actually supported by research. When people learn language through context and emotion, the brain forms stronger memory connections. Conversations about real life, whether daily experiences, personal opinions, activate more areas of the brain than memorizing vocabulary lists. Emotion anchors language. Meaning anchors language. That is why storytelling and real-life practice are powerful learning tools. And strangely, Texas heat was providing the perfect story environment. Everywhere I went, someone was talking about it. How do you handle this weather? Cold drinks help. You get used to it after a while. The topic was repetitive, but the repetition was exactly what my brain needed. Each conversation made the next one easier. Each sentence built confidence for the next sentence. And slowly my listening skills improved too. At first, American speech sounded fast and blended together. But now my brain could recognize familiar patterns. How's it going no longer sounded like one long word. Did you find everything okay? No longer confused me. The sounds were becoming clear, like adjusting the focus on a camera lens. And then something even more interesting began happening. Conversations became a little more personal. One afternoon, the stranger from earlier sat at the table next to mine. We had already exchanged a few casual sentences before, so the silence did not feel uncomfortable. After a moment, they asked, "So, are you getting used to Texas yet?" The question was simple, but it carried curiosity. I thought for a moment. "Yes," I said slowly. "The heat is strong, but people are very friendly." They smiled. That's Texas. That short conversation lasted less than a minute, but something about it felt different, warmer, more natural. And in that moment, I realized something powerful about language learning. You do not need perfect grammar to build connection. You need honesty, patience, and the courage to keep speaking. Because every small conversation is like a tiny brick. One brick alone cannot build a house, but many bricks together create something strong. And somewhere in those everyday exchanges about heat, coffee, and patience, my English foundation was quietly growing stronger. What I did not realize yet was that these conversations were also building something else. A friendship. And maybe something more. Because sometimes the same simple sentence repeated enough times begins opening new doors. And in Texas, even the hottest days can lead to unexpected stories. Especially when two people start sharing the same shade from the sun. Texas culture and communication. Texas teaches language in a strange way. Not through textbooks, not through grammar charts, but through everyday life. And sometimes the biggest English lessons are hidden inside simple cultural habits. After a few weeks in Texas, I began noticing something interesting about how people communicate here. They talk a lot, not in a stressful way, not in a complicated way, just naturally. At first, this surprised me. In many places around the world, strangers do not speak to each other very often. People stay quiet in elevators. They avoid eye contact in stores. But in Texas, silence is rare. Someone will start a conversation almost anywhere. At a grocery line, at a gas station, even while waiting for traffic lights. And most of the time, the conversation begins with something simple. The weather. Of course. Because in Texas, the weather is never boring. One afternoon, I was walking toward the coffee shop again. The sun was high, and the sidewalk felt warm through my shoes. A man watering plants outside a small shop looked up and said, "Hot one today." Just 3 words. Hot one today. But that sentence carried an invitation. In Texas culture, simple comments like this are a social bridge. They allow strangers to connect without pressure. So I answered,
Yes.
"Very hot."
He laughed.
"You'll survive." Everyone complains, but nobody leaves. That sentence made me smile. Everyone complains, but nobody leaves. Later I realized something important. These small conversations are actually training exercises for English learners. They teach natural communication patterns. And those patterns are not always taught in classrooms. For example, Americans often use humor to make conversations lighter. When someone says, "It's hot enough to cook an egg on the sidewalk," they are not giving a cooking suggestion. They are making a joke. Understanding humor is part of understanding culture. And culture is part of understanding language. Linguists often explain that language and culture grow together. When you learn one, you slowly begin understanding the other. Texas culture, in particular, values friendliness. People smile easily. They greet strangers. They use relaxed phrases like y'all, which simply means you all. The first time I heard someone say, "How are y'all doing?" my brain paused for a second. Y'all? But soon I realized something important. These local expressions are not obstacles. They are clues. They show how language lives inside a community, inside daily life. And once you recognize them, listening becomes easier. One afternoon inside the coffee shop, the barista greeted a customer with a cheerful voice. "How y'all doing today?" The customer answered, "Just trying to stay cool." Everyone laughed. Even though the conversation was simple, it created a shared moment. And shared moments are powerful for language learners. Psychologists say the brain remembers language better when it is connected to social interaction. When you hear a phrase while laughing, smiling, or sharing a moment with someone, the memory becomes stronger. That afternoon, I joined the laughter. Not because my English was perfect, but because I understood the feeling of the conversation. And that was new for me. Later, the familiar stranger from previous days walked into the coffee shop again. By now we had exchanged several small conversations. Nothing dramatic, just the usual Texas topics.
Heat.
Coffee. Surviving summer. They sat at the counter and looked outside at the blazing sunlight. Feels like the sun moved closer this year, they joked. The barista nodded. Every summer feels like that. Then they looked toward me. You getting used to it yet? This time I answered without hesitation. Maybe a little, I said. But I think Texas is testing my patience. The stranger laughed. That's part of the experience. Part of the experience. Another phrase my brain happily stored. Conversations like this might seem ordinary, but they are incredibly valuable for learners, because every exchange teaches three things at once: vocabulary, pronunciation, and cultural rhythm. For example, Texans often stretch certain words. Their speech has a relaxed flow, almost like storytelling. Listening to that rhythm again and again helped my brain adapt. Instead of hearing random sounds, I began hearing patterns. And once patterns appear, comprehension grows faster. Language learning experts sometimes describe this stage as the familiarity phase. You're no longer completely lost, but you're not completely fluent either. You're somewhere in the middle. And that middle stage is where many learners quit, because progress feels slow. But the truth is, this stage is actually where the biggest transformation happens. Your brain is quietly building automatic understanding. The process just takes time. Texas heat, strangely enough, helped me accept that. When the temperature outside is extreme, you learn something important. You cannot rush everything. You move slower. You drink more water. You breathe carefully. And somehow that slower pace also helped my English. I stopped trying to sound impressive. I focused on sounding clear.
I stopped worrying about mistakes.
I focused on staying in the conversation. And those small decisions began changing everything. Not only my language skills, but also my connections with people around me. Because communication is not about perfect sentences. It is about shared moments, shared laughter, shared patience. And sometimes those shared moments grow into something deeper. At that time, I still believed I was simply practicing English. But life had a more interesting plan waiting. Because patience, like language, often grows through small interactions over time. And soon those conversations inside the coffee shop would begin revealing a new chapter in my Texas story. A chapter that had less to do with grammar and more to do with understanding another person. When patience is tested. Patience sounds like a calm word. Peaceful, balanced, almost gentle. But real patience rarely feels gentle when you are living inside the moment. Real patience feels uncomfortable. It feels slow. Sometimes it even feels like failure. And if there is one place that quietly teaches patience, it might be Texas in the middle of summer. By this time, my routine had become familiar. Every afternoon, I walked through the hot streets toward the same coffee shop. The sunlight reflected off cars and windows, and the air shimmered above the pavement. Inside the cafe, everything felt calmer.
Cool air.
Soft music. Friendly voices. It had become my unofficial English classroom, but something new was beginning to happen in my life. Conversations were becoming longer, and longer conversations bring new challenges. You see, short conversations are easy. A few sentences about the weather, a quick joke about the heat. But when conversations grow deeper, your English must grow with them. One afternoon, the familiar stranger from earlier weeks sat down at the table across from me. By now we had exchanged enough small talk to recognize each other easily. "Mind if I sit here?" they asked. The question was simple, but my brain still paused for half a second before answering. "No problem," I said. They placed their cold drink on the table and sighed dramatically. "I swear Texas gets hotter every year." I smiled.
Yes.
"I think my patience is melting." That sentence made them laugh. "Your patience will grow stronger," they said. "Everyone here learns that eventually. Your patience will grow stronger." That phrase stayed in my mind, because patience was exactly what my English still needed. During our next conversation, something interesting happened. Instead of discussing weather again, the stranger asked a different question. "So, what brought you to Texas?" Suddenly the conversation became personal, and personal conversations are more difficult for language learners. You must explain ideas, tell stories, describe experiences. My brain started organizing words carefully. "I moved here for a new chapter," I said slowly, "and also to improve my English." They nodded thoughtfully. "That's brave," they said.
Brave.
I had not thought of language learning as bravery before, but maybe it was. Every time you speak a second language, you risk making mistakes. You risk sounding different. You risk feeling embarrassed. Yet you continue speaking anyway. That is a form of courage. Language researchers sometimes call this communication resilience. It means continuing a conversation even when your vocabulary is limited or your grammar is imperfect. And resilience grows only through experience, not perfection. The conversation continued for several minutes. We talked about Texas weather, local food, and small cultural surprises I had noticed. For example, Texans love friendly phrases. "Howdy, y'all. Stay cool out there." These expressions felt warm and welcoming, but they were also part of a communication style that took time to understand. At one point, the stranger asked another question. "Do you miss home?" That question carried emotion. And emotional topics are always harder in a second language. I thought for a moment before answering. "Yes," I said honestly. But learning something new makes the journey meaningful. They smiled gently. "That's a good way to see it."
Good way to see it.
Another phrase quietly added to my growing mental dictionary. But even as my confidence improved, patience was still being tested. Some days conversations felt easy. Other days my listening skills suddenly disappeared again. One afternoon a group of people entered the coffee shop speaking quickly and laughing loudly. Their accents were strong, their sentences fast. For a moment my brain felt overwhelmed again. The old frustration returned. Why does English sometimes feel easy and sometimes impossible? The answer is actually quite simple. Language ability is not a straight line. It moves like waves. Some days your brain processes information quickly. Other days it feels slower. Psychologists explain that fatigue, stress, and unfamiliar accents can temporarily reduce comprehension. But this does not mean your progress disappears. It simply means your brain needs time. Time to adjust. Time to grow. Time to practice patience. That day, I reminded myself of something important. Every conversation, even confusing ones, is part of the learning process. And strangely, the Texas heat outside seemed to reinforce that lesson. The sun did not rush. The summer did not rush. Everything moved at its own pace. And maybe language learning worked the same way.
Slow.
Steady. Gradual. Later that afternoon, the stranger from earlier conversations stood up to leave the cafe. Before walking out the door, they paused and looked back toward my table. "You're improving fast," they said. The compliment surprised me again. "Really?" I asked. "Yeah," they replied. "You sound more confident every week." Confidence. That word felt powerful. Because confidence is often the invisible engine behind language growth. When you believe communication is possible, your brain becomes more flexible. You try new sentences. You listen more carefully. You stay engaged in conversations longer. And slowly, language begins transforming into connection. That afternoon, as I walked back into the warm Texas evening, I realized something surprising. The heat outside was still intense, but it did not bother me as much anymore. Maybe my body was adapting, or maybe my patience was growing stronger. Because learning English in Texas was not just about vocabulary or grammar. It was about learning how to stay calm inside uncomfortable moments. And sometimes those moments lead to unexpected relationships, unexpected friendships, and maybe even unexpected love stories. But those stories only appear when patience lasts long enough to see them unfold. And my patience, tested by language, culture, and Texas heat, was about to face an even bigger challenge. The day I wanted to quit. There is a moment in every long journey when your energy suddenly disappears. Not slowly. Suddenly. Everything that once felt exciting begins to feel heavy. The effort feels endless. The progress feels invisible. And your mind starts whispering a dangerous idea. Maybe it's easier to stop. That moment arrived for me on a very hot afternoon in Texas. The sun was high and bright. The air outside felt thick and slow, like the whole city was moving through warm water. Even the wind felt tired. I had just finished a long day, and my brain felt completely full. I had tried to listen carefully to several conversations earlier that day, but something strange kept happening. People spoke quickly. Too quickly. Their words connected together like fast music again. And my understanding, something that had been improving, suddenly felt weak. It was frustrating. Because nothing discourages a language learner more than feeling like progress has disappeared. One moment you understand. The next moment you feel lost again. That afternoon, I walked into the coffee shop like usual. The bell on the door made its familiar sound.
Ding.
The cool air felt good, but my mind was not calm. I ordered my drink quietly. "Iced coffee, please." The barista smiled, but she noticed something. "You look tired today," she said gently. I tried to laugh. "English is winning today." She laughed softly.
Some days are like that. Some days are like that.
Her sentence sounded simple, but it carried wisdom. Because learning a language is not a straight road. It is more like walking up a hill that sometimes becomes steeper without warning. I took my drink and sat near the window. Outside, the sunlight reflected off the street, and cars moved slowly through the afternoon heat. Inside my mind, the same question kept repeating. Why is this so difficult? I had studied English for years. I had practiced listening. I had tried to speak every day. But sometimes real conversations still moved faster than my understanding. Language scientists actually have a clear explanation for this feeling. Your brain stores vocabulary and grammar in different areas. When you listen to native speakers, those areas must work together instantly. But if the speech is fast, your brain sometimes needs extra time to process meaning. When that time disappears, comprehension drops. It is not failure. It is simply timing. But in that moment, logic did not help my emotions. The frustration felt real. I sat quietly for several minutes, staring at my iced coffee, thinking about something many learners secretly consider.
Quitting.
Not quitting life. Not quitting everything. Just quitting the effort of constantly pushing yourself to understand another language. The idea felt strangely peaceful. No more confusion. No more awkward conversations. No more moments where your brain freezes. Life would become simpler. Many language learners reach this exact moment. Psychologists call it the motivation valley. It is the stage where effort feels high, but visible results feel small. And many people stop right there. But something unexpected interrupted my thoughts. A familiar voice. Rough day. I looked up. The stranger from earlier conversations was standing beside the table. I nodded. My brain feels tired today, I admitted. English is moving too fast. They smiled with understanding and sat down. That happens to everyone learning something new, they said calmly. Everyone. That word helped more than they probably realized. Because when you struggle alone, problems feel personal. But when someone reminds you the struggle is normal, the pressure becomes lighter. They took a sip of their drink and continued. Language learning is like Texas weather, they said. Some days feel easy. Some days feel impossible. I laughed. That sounds accurate. Then they added something interesting. But the only people who fail are the ones who stop showing up. Stop showing up. The phrase landed in my mind like a quiet challenge. Because that was exactly what I had been doing successfully until now. Showing up. Showing up to the coffee shop. Showing up to conversations. Showing up to practice. Language learning researchers often emphasize this exact principle. Consistency beats intensity. A small amount of daily exposure builds stronger neural connections than occasional intense studying. Your brain adapts through repetition, not perfection. The stranger leaned back slightly and looked toward the bright window. Besides, they said casually, you're doing better than you think. I raised an eyebrow. How do you know? They smiled. Because your sentences are longer now. Longer sentences. That detail surprised me. When you are learning a language, you focus so much on mistakes that you rarely notice growth. But growth was happening. Quietly. Slowly. Sentence by sentence. And suddenly the idea of quitting felt premature. Maybe today was simply a difficult day. Maybe my brain was tired. Maybe patience was still the most important skill Texas was teaching me. After a few minutes of conversation, the frustration inside my mind began to soften. The heat outside still felt strong. The language still required effort. But something important had changed again. I remembered why I started. Not just to learn English, but to experience life in a new way, to build connections, to understand people. And sometimes the most important progress happens exactly on the day you almost quit. Because that is the moment you decide whether the story continues. And fortunately for me, the story was far from over. In fact, the next chapter would begin with something surprisingly simple. One honest English sentence. A sentence that would change the direction of several conversations, and maybe even a relationship. One simple English sentence. Sometimes the most important sentence in your life is not long, not complicated, not perfect, just honest. And strangely enough, one simple sentence can change the direction of a conversation and sometimes the direction of a story. That moment happened for me on another warm Texas afternoon. By this point, the coffee shop had become part of my routine. The doorbell rang as usual when I walked in.
Ding. Cool air.
Quiet music. The comforting smell of coffee beans. But something felt different inside my mind that day. After the difficult afternoon when I almost gave up on English, I had decided to change my approach. Instead of trying to sound impressive, I would focus on sounding honest.
No complicated vocabulary.
No pressure to speak perfectly. Just real communication. Language experts often say something very interesting. Communication success depends more on clarity and sincerity than on complex grammar. People understand honesty faster than perfection. I ordered my usual drink. Iced coffee, please. The barista smiled. You're becoming a regular. Regular. That word made me smile. A regular customer means you belong somewhere. For language learners, belonging changes everything. When you feel comfortable in a place, your brain relaxes. And when your brain relaxes, speaking becomes easier. I took my drink and sat down near the same table as before. A few minutes later, the familiar stranger walked in again. At this point, our small conversations had become routine.
Not deep.
Not dramatic. Just friendly. But that day, something shifted. They sat down across from me and asked a simple question. How's your English practice going? A very normal question. But this time I decided to answer differently.
No polites shortcut.
No simple good. Instead, I told the truth. My English is improving, I said slowly, but sometimes I still feel lost. The sentence was simple, but it was honest. And honesty creates connection. They nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly how learning works, they said. Then they added something unexpected. You know, most people think language learning is about vocabulary. I listened carefully. But the real skill, they continued, is patience. Patience again. Texas seemed to repeat that lesson everywhere. I laughed quietly. I think Texas is training my patience every day. They smiled. That's part of the experience here. The conversation continued for several minutes. We talked about daily life, small cultural surprises, and funny misunderstandings that happen when learning a language. For example, I once misunderstood a phrase someone said at a grocery store. They told me, "Take care." And for a moment, I thought they were giving me a health warning. Later, I realized it simply meant goodbye. We both laughed about that story. Laughter, again, helped the conversation feel natural. Communication researchers say laughter acts like social glue. It signals safety, friendliness, and shared understanding. And when people laugh together, conversations often become deeper. That afternoon, something new happened. Instead of ending the conversation quickly, we kept talking about Texas culture, about how people here greet strangers easily, about how weather becomes a universal conversation starter. Then the stranger asked another question. Do you like living in Texas so far? The answer came to my mind instantly. Yes, I said, because people are patient with my English. They smiled warmly. That's good. Communication should never feel like a competition. That sentence stayed with me. Communication should never feel like a competition. Because many language learners secretly treat conversations like tests. Am I correct? Did I pronounce that word right? Did I use the correct grammar? But real conversations do not work like that. They are not exams. They are exchanges. Two people sharing ideas. And when that pressure disappears, language becomes much easier. After a while, the stranger stood up to leave. But before walking out, they said something simple. See you around. 3 words. See you around. Before moving to Texas, I might have worried about how to respond perfectly. But that day my answer came naturally. See you, I said with a smile.
Short, clear, real.
And as I watched them leave the coffee shop, I realized something important. That simple, honest sentence earlier, sometimes I still feel lost, had changed the entire tone of the conversation. Instead of pretending to understand everything, I had allowed space for a real connection. And real connections create real conversations. Real conversations create better listening. Better listening creates better speaking. It is a cycle, a slow but powerful cycle. Language learning researchers often describe this stage as authentic communication. It happens when learners stop focusing only on correctness and begin focusing on meaning. And meaning is what people truly remember. As I finished my iced coffee and stepped back outside into the bright Texas sunlight, something inside my mind felt lighter. English no longer felt like a test. It felt like a bridge to conversations, a bridge to understanding people, and maybe even a bridge to something deeper. Because sometimes the smallest sentence opens the biggest doors. And soon those doors would lead into the next chapter of my life in Texas. A chapter that included something new, something warmer than coffee, something stronger than patience, something that slowly grows when two people keep showing up in the same place on the same hot afternoons. Building life and family in America. Life rarely changes all at once. Most of the time, it changes quietly. Small routines slowly become habits. Familiar faces become friends. And simple conversations slowly turn into something deeper. That was exactly what was happening in my life in Texas. At first, the coffee shop had been only a place to practice English and escape the summer heat. A quiet classroom hidden between the smell of coffee beans and the sound of ice cubes falling into plastic cups. But weeks turned into months. And the routine continued. I would walk through the door in the afternoon. The bell would ring softly.
Ding.
The barista would smile. Iced coffee again? And the answer was always the same. Yes, please. But something else had changed. Conversations were no longer just about the weather. They had grown more personal. The stranger, who had once been just another customer, had slowly become a regular part of those afternoons. At first, we only exchanged small talk about Texas heat and daily routines. But over time, curiosity naturally grows between people who keep meeting in the same place. One afternoon, they asked a question that felt slightly different from the usual topics. So, what do you like most about living in America so far? The question was thoughtful. It required reflection. For a moment, I looked outside through the cafe window. Cars moved slowly under the bright sun. The sidewalks were nearly empty because of the heat. Then I answered honestly. I like how people talk to strangers here, I said. It makes learning English easier. They nodded. That's true. Texans talk a lot. We both laughed. But that simple answer opened the door to a deeper conversation about culture. Because communication styles in different countries can feel very different. In some cultures, conversations begin slowly. People wait until they know each other well before speaking openly. In Texas, friendliness often comes first. A simple, "How are you?" can begin a conversation anywhere. This cultural habit creates a powerful environment for language learners. When strangers are comfortable starting conversations, learners receive more opportunities to practice naturally. Language experts often describe this as environmental immersion. Instead of learning English only through study, learners absorb language through daily social interaction. And that was exactly what was happening to me. Texas was becoming my classroom. But another kind of learning was happening too. Learning about relationships. One afternoon, while we were talking, the strangers shared something about their own life. I grew up here, they said. Texas heat teaches people patience. I laughed. Yes, I am learning that slowly. Then they added something thoughtful. Patience is important in relationships too. The sentence felt simple, but it carried meaning. Because by that time, our conversations were no longer just casual exchanges between strangers. There was familiarity now, comfort, and the quiet curiosity that appears when two people keep returning to the same conversation space. Language learning researchers often say that emotional context strengthens memory. When language connects with personal experiences or relationships, the brain processes it more deeply. Maybe that is why those conversations stayed clearly in my memory. One evening we stayed in the coffee shop longer than usual. The sun had already begun setting outside, and the bright Texas sky slowly turned orange. The barista cleaned the counter quietly, while soft music played in the background. The conversation moved toward something more personal again. What do you want life to look like in a few years? They asked. It was a big question. The kind of question that requires more than simple vocabulary. But something surprising happened. I answered without fear. I want a peaceful life, I said slowly. A family, maybe. And good communication. Good communication. The phrase made both of us smile. Because language had already become part of that journey. Good communication is not just grammar. It is listening, understanding, patience. And those qualities are also the foundation of strong relationships. Weeks continued passing. The Texas summer slowly softened into cooler evenings. The air became more comfortable. Walking outside no longer felt like stepping into an oven. But the habit of meeting in the coffee shop continued. Our conversations expanded. We talked about food, about travel, about the strange differences between cultures. For example, I once explained how confusing American portion sizes felt when I first arrived. Everything seemed larger, even drinks. They laughed and said, "Everything's bigger in Texas." Another famous Texas phrase. Moments like these created a shared history of conversations. And shared conversations slowly build connection. One evening, as we were leaving the coffee shop together, the sky above the city looked soft and calm. The heat of summer had finally relaxed. They paused for a moment and said something simple. "You've come a long way with your English." The compliment felt sincere. "Thank you," I said. Then I added something I truly believed. I think English helped me build a new life here. Because language is more than vocabulary. It is a tool for building relationships, for sharing ideas, for creating a future. As we walked in different directions that evening, I realized something quietly beautiful. The journey that began with frustration and confusion had slowly transformed into something meaningful. English practice had opened the door, but patience and conversation had built the path forward. And somewhere along that path, life in Texas had started to feel less like a temporary adventure and more like home. But even with all this progress, one final lesson about patience, love, and communication was still waiting. Because the real meaning of the Texas heat was not only about temperature. It was about what people learn while enduring it together. What Texas heat really teaches. People often talk about Texas heat like it is the main character of the story.
They complain about it.
They joke about it. They warn newcomers about it. But after living through a full Texas summer, I realized something surprising. The heat itself is not the real lesson. The real lesson is what the heat teaches you. Patience. At first, patience feels like something you are forced to practice. You wait for the air conditioner to cool a room. You wait for the evening when the sun finally lowers. You walk slower because the temperature demands it. But slowly, patience becomes a habit. And that habit begins changing other parts of life too, especially communication. By the time the hottest part of summer began fading, my English journey had already changed in ways I did not expect. Months earlier, conversations in America had felt like puzzles. Now they felt like exchanges, real moments between people. That transformation did not happen overnight. It happened through repetition, through mistakes, through small conversations in a coffee shop where I learned to speak slowly and listen carefully. Language researchers often explain that fluency develops through meaningful interaction. The brain becomes more efficient when language connects to emotion, memory, and personal experience. That was exactly what Texas had given me. Every conversation carried context, weather, culture, humor, and eventually friendship. One evening I returned to the coffee shop as usual. The summer heat had finally softened. The air outside felt warm but not overwhelming. Inside, the same quiet atmosphere welcomed me again.
Cool air.
Soft music. The familiar smell of coffee. The barista greeted me with a friendly voice. "You survived the summer." I laughed. "I think Texas trained my patience." She nodded knowingly. "That's how it works here." That sentence stayed with me as I sat down with my drink. Texas trained my patience. Because patience had become the most valuable skill in my language journey. Not vocabulary, not grammar, Patience. When you are patient with language, something interesting happens. You stop fighting the learning process. You stop demanding instant results. Instead, you allow progress to appear gradually. Psychologists describe this mindset as growth acceptance. When learners accept that improvement takes time, their brains remain open to new information, and that openness accelerates learning. Looking back, I could see the difference clearly. In the beginning, every mistake felt frustrating. Now mistakes felt normal. In the beginning, fast conversations created anxiety. Now they simply felt like practice opportunities. And the most important change was this. I no longer felt like an outsider listening to a foreign language. I felt like someone participating in real life. That evening, the familiar friend from earlier conversations arrived again. By this point, our conversations felt easy and comfortable. The silence between sentences no longer felt awkward. That is another sign of true communication. Comfortable silence. We talked about how quickly the summer had passed. It's funny, they said, looking out the window. Everyone complains about Texas heat, but it also slows life down. Slows life down. That phrase captured something important. Because when life slows down, people notice things they usually miss. Small conversations. Small improvements. Small moments of connection. And those small moments often become the most meaningful memories. I shared a thought that had been growing in my mind. When I arrived here, I said, I thought learning English meant studying harder. They nodded. That's what most people think. But now, I continued, I think it means living more. Living more. Experiencing conversations. Making mistakes, listening to stories, and sometimes even sharing your own story. Language learning experts often emphasize storytelling as one of the most powerful learning methods. When learners connect language with personal experiences, the brain builds deeper memory pathways. Stories make language memorable. Stories make language human. And in my case, the Texas summer had slowly turned into a story about growth. Growth in language. Growth in confidence. Growth in understanding another culture. But perhaps the most meaningful lesson had nothing to do with language itself. It was about patience in relationships. Because good communication is not only about speaking clearly. It is about listening carefully, understanding emotions, giving people time to express themselves. Those same qualities also build strong friendships and sometimes something even deeper. As the evening grew darker outside, the coffee shop became quieter. A few customers left. The music softened. The moment felt peaceful. For a long time I had thought of Texas heat as something to survive. But now I understood something different. The heat had forced me to slow down. Slowing down helped me listen. Listening helped me learn. And learning helped me connect with people. Sometimes the most powerful lessons hide inside uncomfortable experiences. The sun, the sweat, the frustration. But when patience grows strong enough, those experiences become something else. They become part of a meaningful story. And my story in Texas was about to reach its final chapter. A chapter that would connect language, patience, and love in a way I never expected when I first stepped into that coffee shop months earlier. Because sometimes the place that teaches you a new language also teaches you how to build a new life. The quiet reward of not giving up. Some life lessons do not arrive with dramatic moments.
No loud celebration.
No sudden victory. Instead, they arrive quietly. Almost so quietly that you only recognize them when you look back. That is exactly how the final lesson of my Texas story appeared. Not during the hottest day. Not during a big event. But during an ordinary evening that slowly revealed something meaningful. By the time autumn began touching Texas, the air had finally changed. The sun still shined brightly, but the heavy summer heat had softened. Walking outside felt different. People stayed outdoors longer. Coffee shop doors opened more often, and conversations seemed to flow more easily. It was on one of those calm evenings that I walked into the familiar cafe again. The bell above the door rang softly.
Ding.
For months, that simple sound had welcomed the beginning of my daily English practice. At first, it had felt like stepping into a classroom. Now it felt like stepping into a small part of my life. The barista smiled immediately. You made it through the Texas summer. Her voice carried the friendly humor Texans often use. Yes, I said with a laugh. I survived. But inside my mind, I knew something deeper had happened. I had not only survived the heat, I had grown because of it. The iced coffee in my hand felt cold and refreshing as usual, but the environment around me felt warmer in a different way. Not because of the weather, because of familiarity. Familiar places give language learners confidence. When your brain recognizes an environment, it spends less energy understanding the surroundings. That extra energy becomes available for communication. Language researchers call this contextual comfort. And contextual comfort helps conversations flow naturally. A few minutes later, the familiar friend from so many previous afternoons walked through the door. At this point, our greetings felt natural.
No awkward pauses. No hesitation.
Just a relaxed smile.
Hey, they said.
Hey, I replied. Simple words. But those simple words represented months of growth. When we first started talking, every sentence required effort. My brain had to translate, organize, and carefully pronounce each word. Now the words arrived more naturally. Not perfect, but real. We sat down and started talking about everyday things again.
Work.
Weekend plans.
Food.
Small moments that fill normal life. Then, during a quiet pause, they said something thoughtful. You know, your English sounds much more natural now. The comment surprised me slightly, because progress often feels invisible while you are living inside it. But other people notice. And that realization made me smile. Thank you, I said. I think patience helped. They nodded slowly. Patience helps with almost everything. That sentence carried more truth than it first appeared, because patience had shaped every part of my journey in Texas. Patience with the heat. Patience with learning English. Patience with cultural differences. And patience with building relationships slowly instead of rushing them. One of the most powerful ideas in language learning psychology is something called emotional persistence. It means continuing your effort even when progress feels slow or uncertain. Many learners stop too early. They become frustrated. They think they are not improving. But improvement often happens quietly beneath the surface. Just like roots growing under the soil before a plant becomes visible. Looking back, I realized how close I had once come to quitting. There had been a day when frustration almost convinced me to stop practicing English in public. A day when embarrassment felt stronger than motivation. But something small had changed that direction. A simple conversation, a kind response, a moment of patience. Those small moments are powerful because encouragement from others can change how we see ourselves. Instead of feeling like someone struggling with a foreign language, I slowly began seeing myself as someone building a new life. And building a life always takes time. That evening the conversation moved toward the future. What do you think you'll remember most about your first year in Texas? They asked. The question made me pause. I looked around the coffee shop. The same tables. The same soft music. The same smell of coffee beans. Then I answered honestly. I think I'll remember the conversations. Not the grammar lessons. Not the vocabulary lists. The conversations. Because conversations had turned language into something alive. Language was no longer just information. It was connection. And connection changes everything. The sky outside had turned deep blue by the time we finished our drinks. People slowly left the cafe. The barista cleaned the counter again, just like many evenings before. But this evening felt different. Not dramatic. Just meaningful. As we stood up to leave, my friend said something simple. I'm glad we kept running into each other here. I smiled. Me too. Because sometimes life's most important relationships begin in the most ordinary places. A coffee shop, a short conversation, a shared laugh about Texas heat. Those moments may seem small at first, but they quietly grow into something meaningful. As I stepped outside that evening, the air felt cool compared to the heavy summer days months earlier. The sky stretched wide above the Texas streets. And for a moment, I reflected on the entire journey, from confusion, to frustration, to patience, to connection. The heat of Texas had tested more than my comfort. It had tested my persistence. But persistence had created something valuable. Confidence, friendship, and a deeper understanding of communication. Because the real secret to learning English is not speed. It is courage. The courage to speak imperfectly. The courage to keep trying. And the courage to stay patient with yourself. And sometimes, when you refuse to give up, life rewards you quietly. Not with loud applause, but with something better. A new voice, a new connection, and a new chapter of life that begins with one simple decision. Keep going. Sometimes the biggest changes in life begin with the smallest decision. Not giving up. What started as a simple attempt to practice English in a small Texas coffee shop slowly became something much deeper, a journey of patience, communication, culture, and unexpected human connection. The heat tested patience. The conversations tested courage. And the language slowly opened doors to a new life. But here is the truth many English learners don't realize. Fluency is not built in a classroom. It grows inside real stories, real emotions, and real conversations. And this is exactly what this channel is about. On this channel, every story is designed to help you listen, understand, and speak English naturally, while discovering the hidden lessons inside everyday life in America. So, if this story made you curious, imagine what the next story might reveal. Maybe another unexpected friendship. Maybe another cultural surprise. Maybe another life lesson hidden inside a simple conversation. Your English journey is just beginning. If you enjoyed this story and want to improve your listening, speaking, real-life English, make sure to like the video to support the channel, comment your thoughts or your English learning story, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next real English story, because the next story might teach you the one lesson that changes everything in your English journey. And remember, sometimes the path to better English starts with one simple conversation. See you in the next story.